Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Founders Network Smith edition, because I'm really pleased today to be joined by one of our speakers from Social Media Finance 2020, Chris Hawes, who is a senior editor at the Economist Group Client Services team. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on the call today, be it remotely.
No, thank you, James. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and I really wanted to get your insights, and I'm really excited to have you speaking at the event, because so much has changed over the last few months, and the Economist Group and what the brand have done, and how you've built a community and how you've communicated the quite at times, well, often complicated world we live in is something I really admire. And so it's really good to have you on the call, and be really good to kind of dig into a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of trends, and to give people a preview of what you're going to be speaking about at the event.
Yeah, for sure. No, well, it's I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the sort of kind of changing world and how we go about it, because in terms of what we do in the client solutions team, it's kind of helping businesses communicate with their clients in a way that helps them sort of untangle the complexities that are surrounding kind of what's going on at the moment, but more interestingly, sort of what's going on with their services and how they can offer and improve situations for their clients.
So what's, in your opinion, I suppose, without going into too much detail, what are you seeing are the big pillars of change in terms of a very high macro level, in terms of where you're seeing things as a part of a massive publishing behemoth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, in terms of the place that I work and how I work with clients, what's interesting is the way firms are using social media to connect with people. I think innovation in social media is kind of forced by having to communicate with your clients in a different way. So you've seen a lot of change in smaller businesses, and particularly in the retail sector. So you've got like restaurants, chains, entertainment places. They're all using social media to create this online conversation and then try and kind of transcend that into the real world.
Yeah.
So I think there was one restaurant I was speaking to recently are releasing their own series of recipe kits where you can kind of come up with your own recipes, kind of tweak them, and then when lockdown's over, the idea is that you come in and you speak to the chef and you compare your own recipes. So I think a lot of innovation is being driven by these smaller companies, and it'll be interesting to see how larger companies can adopt that and can sort of use this blending of the digital and real worlds.
And do you think social media is an ally in terms of publishing as an art, I suppose, or as a discipline, or do you think it's a foe? Because obviously there's always this kind of debate around what does social media mean to people who are creating these amazing journalistic pieces. Do you find what's your kind of take on that?
Well, again, it's interesting. I mean, for the Economist as a publisher, it's obviously a huge boon to be able to reach this huge market and to speak to people that aren't even necessarily subscribers, and it works as kind of a front end tool as well, in terms of getting people to engage with the brand and then maybe bringing subscribers in. But in terms of how it makes it more complicated for creating content, and this is specific for businesses, is that you need to be more attuned to who you're speaking to. So with social, you're obviously creating content that's going to reach a huge audience, and you can tailor that depending on how targeted your marketing is. But if you're talking to a huge group of, let's say, senior business leaders, then if you pick a topic like sustainability, that's going to mean completely different things for a business leader that works in, say, the automotive sector than someone that works in the financial sector. These big topics, you need to, and this is what we really try and do with clients, is we try and drill into firstly, who are they speaking to? And then secondly, what does that topic mean to them? And what are the nuances of that? And how can we draw them out in quite an engaging way? So it's certainly social media in aggregate is of course a huge benefit for the publishing industry, but it comes with the caveat that you need to be more specific in your content, and you need to be more focused on who you're talking to, why are you talking to, and why is what you're saying interesting and relevant to them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a conversation with someone else who was in the publishing industry in the healthcare space, and her name was Sen Boyaki, and she was saying that publishing everyone's going to have to become a publisher in some way, like a small way. So yeah. I suppose I'm guessing a lot of your work is helping bring out people's, it sounds really cheesy, in a publisher, in terms of like creating these compelling stories and narratives, and how to really make interesting content. Is that kind of like where you see things going?
Yeah, but in the same way, I think that's almost a problem, in the sense that everyone's a publisher. So are you really producing content that's of benefit to the conversation? Yeah. Are you moving the conversation forward? And I know, particularly in the times that we're living in at the moment, that clients, businesses don't necessarily know whether they should be talking about a topic, or whether they shouldn't. So, it's every business has a right to talk about a topic if they're actually doing something constructive towards moving it forward or moving it in the right direction. Yeah. It's how you phrase that's the tricky bit. It's not deciding whether you should be talking about something, it's talking about how you should be talking about and why you're talking about it. Is it for a productive reason? And in that sense, I think it's great that everyone's a publisher, but that comes with the need to figure out what your brand is and what it stands for. And particularly in regards to the crisis, I think it was the Edelman Trust Barometer recently that said that people are kind of losing. They think that private sector has handled the crisis quite badly. And I think that's almost a reflection on how businesses have been messaging during the crisis as well as how they've performed. And in terms of what businesses tend to do is, when there's a crisis, they tend to try and reinvent their core message. They try and write about a new normal or a new landscape for the industry and this kind of thing. And that's true in a sense, but the way you build trust is to kind of drill down into your reason for existing. So why is my business existing in the first place? And how is this crisis another step towards that vision? How can I view that through my company's own, reason to exist, sort of thing?
Yeah, and it's the idea of trust and people losing trust. One of the areas where I actually found one of the few sectors where trust seems to have actually got better is in financial services, and maybe because financial services had such a low starting point after 2008, trust was so low after because the crisis last time was a crisis of monetary. It was a financial crisis, whereas this crisis is a health crisis, which has spilled over to become an economic crisis. So, what do you think is the position of finance brands now and in the future, in terms of what's their voice? And it's quite hard to orientate yourself as a brand, particularly in finance. Like, what are you trying to achieve on social media, and kind of what's the big vision for brands, and how do they find it in finance?
Yeah, well, I don't think this is finance specific, but the place I'd start with how you should approach it is the quickest way for your audience to lose trust in your brand is for your company to talk about a subject in generic terms. You see this quite a lot. You'll see companies talking now about financial sustainability. You'll talk about automation, big, broad topics, but for each individual reader, those topics mean something completely different. So I think going back to how financial services can build trust. I think they really need to regard it as a conversation with individuals rather than producing or projecting their vision sort of forward. So to link my my last point, which was in regard to a company's reason to exist, I think what a financial services firm should do is go back to why do we exist, and where are we moving forward? How is this crisis just another step towards that? Then have a think about how you can start that conversation with individual members of your audience. So who are they? Who are the people that you're servicing? If you're an insurance broker, who are the insurers that you want to be speaking to? What are their specific problems? And how can you, as a business, offer them a solution in terms of your unique reason to exist as a company? So I think what will change in terms of social media is, I think that people are becoming less tolerant of people speaking in generic terms, or businesses speaking in generic terms about these big issues. So what we and other publishers who are working with clients want to do is kind of help people understand how they can talk in specifics to people. How can they create interesting stories that actually resonate with individual audience members rather than a huge group of business leaders or whoever it might be?
And I think part of the problem is that if you're in marketing communications, you have this constant information and different, quite rightfully, really quite big issues now. You can't escape them, and so you feel like, oh my god, there's a massive cultural issue, or there's an environmental issue. There's now a healthcare issue. So you have all these different issues, and you think, well, as corporate comms, maybe we should talk about everything. But what you're saying is actually, if you find out what if you're a bank, then your ballpark is, we help people build, financial security into their lives and help them get on a property ladder and build robustness. This is our ballpark of where we know we feel confident talking about. And if the issue goes into that space, we can talk about authentically, but we can't talk about a healthcare crisis because we don't have the expertise. And it just sounds like we're just jumping on a bandwagon. Is that kind of what you're kind of insinuating?
Well, I think there's a few different points in that. So firstly, in relation to the cultural crisis, as you could term it, it's sort of the protests that are going on and the Black Lives Matter protests. And a lot of companies kind of ask, do they have a reason to talk about it? And the answer is that, companies are kind of as equally culpable as the rest of us are for what's going on, and they have the same. They should have the same motivations to change. So, if companies are going to talk about cultural issues, they need to have kind of skin in the game, in the sense that they're actually making changes that matter, and they're not just, well, I wouldn't say that companies are creating superficial or pushing superficial change, but you need to make sure that your change is actually going to impact people's lives in a positive way, and therefore you do have a reason to talk about it. So that's what I'd say about the cultural side of things. When you talk about things that companies have more of a right to play in, and that's thinking about the future of business, so automation, technology, remote working, which is an extension of the healthcare crisis and the economic crisis that's going on at the moment. In those specific issues, what we help businesses do is, taking automation, you think about how would automation affect my customer. So my customer base stretches across people who work in automotive industries to people who are food suppliers. So can I take specific challenges that they're facing and weave them into a broader narrative about the direction of automation? And it's kind of a journalistic approach, in the sense that you need to go out and actually speak to these people about what are their challenges. And in that way, I suppose there will be quite an interesting kind of movement in terms of the content department, or the content creation of a business, having more of a strategic role. So they're getting close to salespeople client services people who are on the front line speaking to clients. What are the challenges they're facing? How can I, as a content creator, find a broader narrative in terms of how can my company help them achieve that specific goal? So there's interesting kind of overlaps in terms of the different areas, and I think content's going to start playing a more central role in companies' directions, and also how companies speak to their clients and their prospective clients.
And it's that kind of change between a monologue to a dialogue. And I suppose journalism as a practice is the art of being a journalist. I know how to do journalism, but it sounds like it's almost like an area. I'm thinking about it from a business perspective. I don't see many companies or brands doing good journalistic content, even if it's within a very narrow field, because it's always a white paper, and I'm guilty of it, a white paper on this is what we think, or this is a video on what we think, rather than going, well, why don't we just investigate what people think? But I suppose the problem is it's a skill which I don't have. Our team lots of companies don't have a journalism team to do this, and there's ethics and codes of practice, and you go into a whole different universe. So I suppose that's where you guys probably come in, is kind of to bridge that gap beyond, well, you're not just doing white paper, you're now actually doing journalism, which is very different to traditional content creation.
Well, in terms of, I wouldn't say that, so journalism is defined by the fact that you need to have an independent and unbiased voice, and that's why I think The Economist is so, as a publication, is so well regarded, because it's so independent. And well, I don't work on the magazine side. I work specifically helping the content, so in the commercial department. But companies won't be involved in journalism, so to speak, but companies can certainly take some of the strategies and practices of journalism. So what I would say those are actually going out and talking to people that have specific perspectives on issues. So, you know, it's actually going out and talking to clients about the kind of nuances of a topic. How are they experiencing automation? What are the impacts of remote working on bringing teams together, in terms of if you're a food supplier or whatever it might be, or if you're working in mechanical engineering, how does remote working affect supply chains, this kind of thing. So it's not a sense that companies will be coming up with journalism, and you don't necessarily need to have journalists on your team, but certainly when you're creating content, it's worth thinking about what are the practices that go into creating good journalism.
It's like the skill, the toolkit. Here's a toolkit of journalism. You're not a journalist, but here's the tools. Go off and do some research, and that two-way exchange value is so, I think, important for content, and that's what we're noticing. And on that note, in terms of the event, what is a high-level overview of the discussion? And on top of that, the added point is, what are you kind of focusing on within finance in terms of, like, where are you seeing shifts happening, and what can people expect from the conversation? So there's two questions to that. So from the event and the macro on perspectives of the future. Yeah,
so I mean, the first thing I'll be talking about is how do we, as the Economist Group, think about creating content? And there are two levels to that, because we want to get to the social media part. How should you be using social media? But the first thing that you need to think about before that is, what are you saying, and how do you come up with good content that you can then convert into good social media conversation? So we'll be speaking firstly about what goes into creating good content, and that might be articles, videos, infographics, data visualizations, a lot of different kind of ways of telling a story that are going to resonate. How can you then take that content and convert it into a conversation? And you had a nice phrase earlier, which was moving from, was it a monologue to a dialogue?
Yeah.
And I think
it wasn't mine, unfortunately. I don't know that term. I heard it from somewhere else. So
okay. Well, it was well plagiarized, because no, I think that's exactly it, because it's how do you take that content that you've created and then turn it into into a conversation with your audience members. So we'll be thinking a little bit about how do we as the Economist group go about doing that? How do we approach clients' challenges? What do they want to be saying to their audience? And then that conversation kind of leads us into what maybe we've been talking about a little bit here, which is how should businesses be using social media more as a tool to start conversations? How is it going to become this kind of this tool for the front office? I guess, you know, how should salespeople be using content? How should they be using social media? Because it's not just a brand building kit. It's going to become something that's much more integrated into the whole mechanics of a business. When people are working from home, you won't be in the city as much. People will have different schedules, this kind of thing. It's going to be more difficult to arrange conversations.
Yeah.
And I think content is a really interesting way to kind of bridge that gap and continue creating conversations. There's actually a quote from an industry journalist who was recently speaking to an insurer, and the insurer said that they were essentially living off social capital that was accrued before the crisis. So making the case that, you know, we're not able to go out and speak to clients, we're not able to bring in new business, so we're living off these relationships we built before. Yeah. But that doesn't have to be the case. You know, how can we use content to actually create relationships through social media, rather than just relying on social media and real life conversation as two disparate elements? How can we integrate the two?
And so it's really refreshing to hear you say that, because we always speak about how important content is for sales professionals that are, I don't do content. The old way of things have changed now. Like the network effect of, I mean, I still think that the value of your network is still important, but there's almost a meritocracy in a sense of, well, if you're putting out valuable stuff and you're actually taking the time to understand what people want to hear about, then people are naturally going to buy from you. But if you're just relying on this, I think it's a really good quote, you know, that sort of capital from a bygone era. We've been around for 100 years and we're trusted. It's like the rules of engagement are kind of changing now on social media, and the whole digital landscape is changing. And like, you have to fight. I think every brand has to fight for their space, even if you're established. You have to have a real kind of what's the word? Almost a startup attacking mentality of it.
Yeah, and it gets you thinking about what are some of the branding. What's some of the branding that we see every day, and what's the purpose of it? So you go into the city, particularly in Canary Wharf, you've got the huge buildings with huge logos, HSBC, City, across all the skyscrapers, and you kind of think, what's the purpose of those logos? And it's obviously to project your brand's centrality in the industry.
Yeah.
But as we kind of move across to this new, almost social media kind of integrating with real life conversations, what's the equivalent of those huge logos on these buildings? Is it thought leadership? Is it well done thought leadership? And that's quite an interesting question in terms of where's your brand best positioned to make sure that people see you as this central part of the industry?
Yeah. Your point, you're asking whether it's people that make a brand now, whether it's the individuals, particularly B2B. Is it actually the people? Like, is it your 7 sales team members? Is that your brand? Or is it this monolithic, we are Social Tree Global, or we are the Economist Group, and people buy into that? I suppose it's a question which is still, I mean, I think it's a bit of both, personally. I think the brand helps, but the personal element is vital. But again, I don't know. I'm not the authority on.
No, I don't think that's a straight answer. But you know, what I would say is that a brand is kind of defined by its purpose. And since I joined the Economist Group, I've seen that even more. So the Economist Group, when it was founded in 1843, it was founded with the purpose of overruling the Corn Laws, which essentially meant that big wealthy landowners would accrue all the value of foreign trade. So so essentially the Economist has always stood for free markets, free movement of people, free information, this kind of thing. And the world, as the world kind of turns in on itself, that brand value makes the Economist's voice even more valuable because it's got a stake in the argument. You have a position. And when you think about other businesses and what their brand values are, I think that's quite interesting as well. You know, does your brand value give you more of a stake in the conversation? Does it give you more reason to be arguing or talking about things? And I think that's where a lot of the value of content comes, in creating this conversation that's actually worth having. Yeah,
it's absolutely fascinating. I'm really genuinely so excited to hear your conversation, and I'm a massive fan of. I know obviously you're not part of The Economist, but the publication and everything around it. I read it myself, so I'm a bit of a fanboy when it comes to this content. So I'm really looking forward to the talk, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
No problem, James. Thanks very much. Looking forward to speaking to everyone then.